Okay, so let's dive into today's topic, which is oil, Middle East, and geopolitical power play. This is the second presentation of our series, and this is a very interesting topic, as well as a topic which basically gives us an insight on how the sufferings in Muslim worlds have progressed and what are the main economic reasons behind it. Of course, there are ideological reasons as well as political reasons, but oil has been the single most economic reason for which there has been a lot of turmoil in the Middle East, both on the Persian side and the Arab side. A little bit of history here. After the Industrial Revolution, most of the industrial work and locomotion was based on steam engines. This was based on translating the coal into steam engines, and it was an extremely inefficient source of mechanization. After the 1850s and late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a rapid demand for oil because of inefficiency in coal as an energy source. At the same time, there were developments that were happening in the United States and other parts where automobiles were being commoditized by Ford in 1908, and then even trucks and planes were coming up. Electricity was becoming more popular and was bringing lifestyle changes which needed more power. So here I listed a few key milestones. In 1863, first oil refinery was built in Poland. 1873, first oil pipeline was constructed in Pennsylvania. 1885, Carl Benz, who was the founder of Mercedes-Benz, patented the gasoline-powered car. In 1895, first modern oil tanker was built. In 1901, oil was discovered in Texas in bulk. In 1908, a Ford's Model T car enters mass production. Just an FYI, before Middle East, oil producers were mainly from United States, from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, and from Russian Caucasus in the region of Baku, where Rothschild had their investments, and then in Canada and Asia. Let's start with Iran. Iran is a special country compared to its position in the Muslim world. In a sense, Iran has a kind of isolated history as well as an interconnected history with Arabs. The first speculation in the oil industry was made by William Dorsey in 1901, when he obtained concession from Iran's Muzaffaruddin Shah. Dorsey was a big speculator in mining industry and made a lot of fortune in Australia and other places. So with that money, he ventured into Iran for exploring oil. They signed a 60-year lease with a company called APOC, which stands for Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They were given 20,000 pounds because nobody knew how much oil was there. So Shah was happy that they were receiving 20,000 pounds and stocks worth of 20,000 pounds in the company, and a guaranteed profit of 16% from the oil exploration. The whole area was granted as a concession except the 5 northern provinces of Iran. For 4 years or so, there was not much traction in oil exploration until there was a big resource that was found at Masjid-e-Suleiman near the Persian Gulf in 1908. So for 6 years, APOC enjoyed a lot of profit from oil production. And then in 1914, British Parliament decided that it's time to get a piece of that profit, and they basically nationalized APOC to some extent, not fully, but partially, and called it British Petroleum. Oil resources were really huge in Iran. For example, in 1933, about 7 million barrels of oil was obtained in Iran, and the revenue from that was about 1.7 million pounds. We have to keep in mind that both Saudi and Iran had been getting a lot of oil wealth since a long time, since 1930s. And in 1970s, their oil profit mounted to several $1 billion. So sometimes the colonial excuse that we give for lack of development in Muslim world, especially in these countries, is not valid because they enjoyed autonomy as well as huge wealth from as early as 1970s. So coming back to the topic, in 1941, World War II started and British needed oil and revenue from oil desperately. So basically they forced the abdication of the father Shah, Reza Pahlavi, and made his son Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi as the Shah of Iran. And in 1945, the war ended with British, France, and all the allied powers in a significantly weak position, and Shah regained control of the resources and oil companies. Oil companies had to make several concessions because of the workers' strikes and the influence of communism. In 1949 and 1950s, there was a bill that was being drafted by Muhammad Mossadegh, who was a very popular politician and who had a lot of fame and was often involved with power struggle with Shah. So he was proposing the nationalization of oil, in which he was basically saying that the oil belongs to the country and it should be returned rightfully to the country, but the companies should be paid 25% for extraction work done by them. Mossadegh became the prime minister and promises prosperity and nationalization of oil. And as always with the case of monarchs of the Middle East, they're always pro-colonial powers, and all these turmoils led to the Aban Crisis, where BP, in order to punish Iran, basically cut the production of oil from Iran to just 4%, in addition to economic blockade of Iran. The oil shortage was compensated by increased production by BP and Aramco from Saudi and Kuwait. To deal with the financial crisis that was going on, Mossadegh asked for powers, but Shah refused to give those special powers to him. As a result, Mossadegh resigned. Then Shah appointed another person as prime minister. His name was Ahmad Khayyam. Widespread protests broke out, and protesters from all circles, from Islamists to communists, started protesting. And then Ahmad Khayyam resigns, and Mossadegh assumes power again and deals with nationalization of the oil. All this culminated in 1953, when CIA and MI6 staged a coup, which basically put Mossadegh in house arrest and gave back the power to Reza Pahlavi. Nationalization was reversed, and a consortium was established with 4 companies: BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Texaco. Profit sharing, which was at 16% in the beginning, became 20% after World War II, and then becomes 50% after the Abadan Crisis. It then becomes 55% and then 100% after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So in 1960, Iran forms an alliance with the Arab countries as well as Venezuela to form the OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. After the formulation of OPEC, the profit percentage for Iran rose to 55%, and then, as I said, 100% after the Iranian Revolution. Iran suffered a lot of casualties in Iran-Iraq conflict, which led to destruction of oil infrastructure and reduced oil production. And since then, there have been many sanctions on Iran from the Western world, but it has continued to survive those sanctions and supply oil through different channels like China, Russia, and India. So that completes the Iranian side of the story, which is somewhat related and somewhat isolated from the rest of the Arab world. So for the rest of the Arab world, I would not go chronologically as I did for Iran. Instead, here, I will try to describe major trends and major events. Most of the material is derived from Eugene Rogan's book, Arab History, and some of my personal research on each topic listed in the book. In Arab world, the discovery began in earnest in 1938. So in Saudi, the concession was obtained by Standard Oil Company of California in 1930s. For 6 years, there was nothing but failure, as Standard Oil didn't discover even a drop of oil throughout Saudi Arabia. Oil was in fact first discovered in Iraq in 1927 by the same company, and then Kuwait in 1938. In 1938, oil was also discovered in huge quantities in Dammam area, which was like the first jackpot for the Standard Oil Company. Since then, the Middle East oil started to increase in proportion, whereas the US production started to decline. Just a note here that the Middle Eastern oil is sweeter, has less density and less sulfur compared to the white crude, which is found in Russia, which is very dense and has higher sulfur content. And same thing goes with shale in the United States. The problem with white crude is that it requires a lot of refinement and technology in order to make it usable. As a result, without proper technology, the oil in these areas, like the Middle Eastern area, is much cheaper to extract than from, say, Russia or United States. So for 4 decades, Western oil companies enjoyed full freedom on oil resources in all the 3 dimensions. The 3 dimensions are setting the price of oil, controlling production, and setting the percentage of profit that is to be shared with the country. However, oil comes with its own challenges. There is something called as resource curse. What I mean by that is that, what it means is that when a country has a lot of resources, the people don't usually pay attention to how the government is functioning, as money is available in abundance. So nobody looks at the expenditure, the checks and balances are lost on government, and this leads to the downfall of the country. The other part of the resource curse is something which is called as Dutch disease, in which basically, for example, if a country is producing oil, a lot of foreign currency comes into that industry, and everybody tries to jump into the oil production. But we have to keep in mind that every human being in the country cannot go in the oil production. We need to also have stores, we need to also have teachers, As a result, what happens is those industries get paid less. However, the inflation keeps on rising, and this leads to what is called as Dutch disease, where other industries and service sectors grow less competitive and decline. Now let's look into two perspectives regarding oil exploration. The first perspective is what is called as nationalist perspective, which most of us as Muslims have, which is that resource belongs to country, foreign companies are just exploitative. They're basically using the country's resources and enriching themselves. That's one perspective. The other perspective is from the capitalist side, which basically says there's a tremendous amount of capital risk which is undertaken before the resource is explored, and there are numerous failures, and it takes a lot of capital to bring infrastructure like pipelines and refineries. So after so much work, the Western oil companies basically say we start to produce something which is usable, and it should not be considered as a nation's resource, but it should be considered as a joint resource. And it doesn't hold only for oil resources or natural resources, but also for something like a Suez Canal, which was basically carved out by Ferdinand Lesseps of France. And basically, France and Britain used it exclusively until Nasser nationalized it, saying that it's the property of Egypt. So for 30 to 40 years, Arab rulers were happy to receive 15 to 30% of profit. However, as the dependency of the country on the oil increases, dissatisfaction starts to grow, and in 1950s, it was observed that oil companies were making 3 times more than what the nation was getting. So with the 35% tax rate, US government was getting more money from Saudi oil than Saudi government. So that was kind of causing some dissatisfaction. And the growing thought is that oilmen have already made their money from oil exploration for such a long period, and now it is the turn of the country to make money. Sovereignty of oil company in 3 dimension that we discussed before became objectionable. So in 1960s, oil countries started to send their students to Western universities to specialize in oil exploration, geology, instrumentation, and chemistry, basically the technical side. And they also sent students to study finance and resource management to better manage the company. So product of these university projects were Abdullah Tariqi from University of Texas and Zaki Yamani, who studied at Harvard University. They brought the negotiating perspective for Arab world, advocating collective action for improving the 3 dimensions, which is the pricing and amount of crude production and the profit percentage sharing. Initially, they didn't get much traction because of the multinational nature of the oil companies, due to which the oil-producing countries feared that the MNCs would go into other countries and leave them without any oil exploration. So initially, there was not much traction from these US graduate students. The trigger for greater say of a country in the oil affairs came in 1959 when BP posted a 10% price cut, keeping into account market conditions. But this price cut means a direct deficit for the oil-producing nations, especially the Saudis. Al-Tariqi rallied Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran for more ownership of the oil resources in the ratio of 60 to 40%. In 1960s, Standard Oil did a similar misstep by cutting price of oil by 7% without informing the country to handle Soviet oil glut. This was viewed as too much of a challenge to a country's sovereignty. This led to the 5 nations coming together to form an organization of petroleum exporting country, OPEC. The 5 countries are Saudi, Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, and Venezuela. Now let's come to Libyan case. In Libya, oil was discovered in 1959, and Libya was the country which basically broke the glass ceiling in terms of negotiating with the oil companies. Libya obtained its independence in 1943 after Italian losses in World War II. King Idris Sanusi was placed as monarch, and he was a very intelligent man and gave small independent contracts to new oil companies because his view was that it would give more incentive for companies to work hard and keep Libya's interest ahead of everything else. So very soon the strategy played out, and Libya became 6th largest producer by 1965, mounting to 10% of the oil market. Idris was viewed as a pro-Western monarch, which he was, and Gaddafi staged a coup against him in 1968. Gaddafi was a big fan of Nasser, so he was a pan-Arabist and very hostile to Western oil industries. He hired Abdullah al-Tariqi as advisor. Abdullah al-Tariqi was fired by Saudis and replaced by Zaki Yamani. but now he found a new job under Gaddafi. 21 companies in Libya were operational at the time. Occidental was the new company in these 21 companies with its only area of exploration in Libya. Gaddafi tested waters by demanding a 30 cents increase in oil prices to $2.83 per barrel. Most of the MNCs refused, but in case of Occidental, Gaddafi put pressure by decreasing its production from 8.65 million barrels to 4.65 million barrels. That this was causing a large loss to Occidental, and basically it agreed to hike the price to $2.83. Gaddafi's famous statement at the time was, "People who lived without oil for 5,000 years can live without oil for a few more years." That's how he was basically threatening all the Western oil companies to agree to the demands or just leave the country. Then he demanded a 90 cents increase in the Mediterranean market. So now Gaddafi is playing aggressive game, and he also wanted the majority of profit for Libya instead of the oil companies, and he negotiated the rate 55% for the country and 45% for the company. This broke the glass ceiling because 50-50 was a sweet spot, your work and my resource, so let's share the profit equally. But now Gaddafi played it aggressively and said 55 for the country, 45 for the company. And this also led to the Tehran Agreement of 1971, which raised production by 5% and increased the price by 35 cents. So Gaddafi had a very big role that he played in breaking the monopoly of the Western oil companies and increasing the share of profit for the Arab nations. Late 1960s and early 1970s saw the age of decolonization for British. Basically, British was wrapping up from Middle East after failing of British Raj. Labour Party comes to power, and it had to devalue pound to take care of its deficit. Deficits also means that the military bases have to be wrapped up, and the protectorate status from UAE and Bahrain and Qatar has to be removed. These small Arab nations basically resisted and wanted British to stay to protect them against Iran's aggression. However, British was in a rush, so it followed a policy of appeasement with Iran. So what that meant was that the Arab nations had to give up islands of Tom and Abu Musa to Iran because British did not want to upset Iran to preserve its oil interest. With these things happening, Iraq protested, and Libya took it as an excuse to nationalize all the British oil interest, basically getting rid of British petroleum, all of it from Libya. Both Iraq and Libya were Arab states, so basically any loss of islands or a territorial area from Arab was viewed as very negatively by these countries. So in short, British grip on Middle East oil kept slipping in late 1960s and early 1970s. Another development to oil producer was the excess supply that was coming from USSR, what we normally call as glut. The glut basically means excess supply. So Russian oil has higher sulfur content and is more dense and it is difficult to extract. But with technological advancements, things were getting cheaper, which basically meant that more oil and more competition for the Middle Eastern countries. Another development in the late 60s and early 70s is the use of oil in the Arab-Israeli conflicts. As we all know that United States is a stubborn supporter of Israel because of strong lobby, the Cold War dynamics, and a lot of high-ranking Zionist officials present in the Western administrations and the Christian evangelist wing. A little bit of history on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 1948, before the independence of Israel, there was a mass attack on Palestinians, which led to displacement of 700,000 Palestinians from their lands, which is popularly referred to as Nakba. This was followed by a war between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and Israel basically defeated all the three Arab nations. This was followed by another conflict in 1956 called Suez Crisis, in which Britain, France, and Israel joined hands in attacking Egypt over the Suez Canal nationalization. United States came to Egypt's rescue by forcing Britain, France, and Israel to back off because it was busy dealing with the Hungarian Revolution, where USSR was supporting the communist regime in Hungary, and United States was trying to overthrow the communist regime there. So all in all, needless to say that the people of Palestine have undergone continuous oppression for the last 100 years. However, late 60s and early 70s saw a new weapon in the arsenal of Arab nation, which is the oil. In 1967 war, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were defeated on the ground. Uh, the other oil-producing nations also supported Egypt, Syria, and Jordan by doing production cuts. However, the oil still made it to the market from other sources. Using oil as a weapon actually backfired because of the loss of revenue and huge oversupply after so many days of no production. This huge oversupply led to oil glut, which reduced the price of oil significantly. And in 1967, the Sinai Peninsula was also captured by Israel. This paved the way for the next war, which is the 1973 war. Both Nasser and his successor Sadat realized that the longer the Sinai stayed with Israel, the more the world would accept the status quo. So Nasser tried hard till his death in 1970, and after his death, Sadat assumed power. Unlike Nasser, Sadat didn't have charisma and needed to prove himself in the military, and this he was determined to do by getting back the Sinai Peninsula. So Egypt did not receive any military supplies from Soviet for last 3 years. So the first step that Sadat took was to fire all the Soviet officials and created confusion between US and USSR camps. The Soviet were thinking that is Nasser going to leave our camp, and USA was trying to get Egypt into their camp by saying, okay, come back to us and we will supply you the weapons. But in the end, Soviet ended up supplying Egypt with a lot of new arms. Then Sadat made a trip to Saudi and other oil-producing nations to get their help in the upcoming expedition, which was done very secretly. This was the backdrop of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. So initially, Egyptian forces made a swift entry into Sinai and captured a large part of Sinai. And Mohammed Hegel remembers this as like a military practice where mission accomplished, check mark, mission accomplished, check mark. So Egyptian forces were making swift moves. However, Israeli forces soon retaliated, and this led to a stalemate situation. In the meantime, the oil-producing nation basically unleashed the oil weapon, causing an oil shock, which raised the prices of oil in US from $2.50 per barrel to $11.50 per barrel. There were long lines in US, but Nixon administration still refilled Israeli arms arsenal. Israeli military progressed, and USSR threatened intervention when the Israeli forces were making a move towards Damascus in Syria. So this kind of raised a nuclear alert, and both USA and USSR thought that it's better to deal with the situation diplomatically and reach a peace agreement. So a peace agreement was signed between Egypt and Israel and Syria and Israel. In all these things, Palestinians were not benefited at all. In fact, their cause was more harmed, and the only thing that was achieved was the regaining of Sinai Peninsula by the Egyptians. In this war, oil embargo ended up with limited success, but it gave Arabs with a new sense of confidence. However, we should note that Zaki Yamani has written that Arabs conceded too much too soon, which means that they could have regained a lot more from this ground operation as well as the oil weapon than what they achieved, because they basically compromised too soon. The next two major events are basically the Iran-Iraq War and the Kuwait War. Both of them were started by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a member of Ba'ath Party, which staged a coup against the Hashemite rulers, King Faisal, in 1968. Saddam grabbed power in Ba'ath Party and became the president of Iraq on 16 July 1979. On the Iranian side, the revolution started in January 1978 and was succeeded in February 1979 when basically the Iranian Revolutionary Guard came to power, and Ayatollah Khomeini basically proclaimed the Islamic Republic of Iran and promised exporting the revolution to other parts of the Muslim world. Saddam was alarmed by this and was also given some nudge by the United States, and Saddam attacked the theocracy in its nascent stage in September 1980, thinking that Iran would be easy to defeat. However, Iran fought back with tenacity. The main objectives were ideological, exporting the revolution, theological, Shia-Sunni divide, and the territorial and the oil fields, basically the oil fields of Rumalia near Shatt al-Arab waterway. The war lasted till 1988 and led to about 500,000 deaths of both civilian and soldiers. Finally, the ceasefire happened in 1988, but this paved the war for the next conflict, which was the Kuwait War. So coming to Kuwait War, Iraq emerged with a debt of $40 billion in the Iran-Iraq War. The infrastructure related to the oil fields were damaged significantly, and all this debt repayment constituted 50% of the oil revenue that Iraq was producing. So Kuwait lent $14 billion to Iraq during this war. Iraq was under tremendous financial pressure. Saddam Hussein was banking on high oil prices, which reached $35 during Iran-Iraq war, and since then they were in continuous decline, reaching $14.50 in July 1990. What this means was a loss of revenue for the Iraqi government. Every dollar drop in crude led to $1 billion loss in Iraq's revenue. Kuwait and other oil-producing nations were also facing these losses due to drop in oil prices. However, Kuwait had a different model for their country. Kuwait basically diversified. They opened a lot of gas stations and refineries in Europe under the brand Q8, basically which refers to Kuwait. So with lower oil prices, Kuwait's profit margin actually increased in these businesses. So Kuwait was of the opinion that the production should be increased. So Iraq and Kuwait were often on the opposite sides and conflicted at OPEC meetings. So Iraq started pinning blames on Kuwait for many things, like it blamed Kuwait for stealing oil from the Rumalia oil field when it was busy fighting with Iran, and it demanded that Kuwait should forgive $14 billion loan that it gave to Iraq, and should offer an additional $10 billion loan to Iraq, and that Kuwait should give back the Burbian and Warba deep water ports. And in the past, Iraq claimed Kuwait to be its territory in 1937 when Iraq obtained its independence, and in 1961 when Kuwait obtained its independence. July 1990, Iraq mobilized tanks to Kuwait's border. Alarmed by the situation, Hosni Mubarak and Shah Fahad called for a meeting at Jeddah. Saddam spoke in the meantime with Ambassador Gillespie from the United States about what's the position of the United States if it gets into conflict with Kuwait. Gillespie said United States is indifferent to Arab conflicts. With this assurance, Saddam invaded Kuwait just after the meeting concluded. The goal of toppling the ruling Al-Sabah dynasty. UN Security Council passes the resolution number 678 condemning Iraq and demanding unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. Kuwait goes into a chaos. Hassan Ali, also known as the Chemical Ali, because of his widespread use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, becomes the prime minister of Kuwait. There were events such as shooting of non-violent Kuwaiti protesters, and all this basically worried all the neighboring Arab states. Bush wanted to interfere right from the get-go, and so did Osama bin Laden, who wanted to intervene instead of America coming and intervening in Arab matters. There were 12 additional resolutions that were passed by United Nations Security Council, and the final resolution was the United Nations Resolution 678, in which the Soviet cooperated with all the 5 nations and called for action against Iraq. Egypt convened an Arab summit, and in the Cairo summit, there was a vote that was put forward as to whether US should be called for intervention. And it was a very divided scenario in which 10 countries basically agreed for the intervention and 9 disagreed. So a very divided situation, but that led to Operation Desert Storm. So these were some of the major events related to oil in Middle East that happened in 20th century. So oil continues to be a major factor in the economic as well as the political arena of the Middle East. So what is the legacy of oil? Oil has been a double-edged sword for the Arab nations. Basically, it had both positive and negative impacts. In terms of economic impacts, it brought immense wealth to the country, better infrastructure creation, and welfare for locals, as well as for the expats who were invited to work in these countries. There are a lot of diversification efforts going on. There is an effort also being made to tackle the resource curse by transforming resources into other sectors. Diversification is also happening in terms of the petrodollars, which are getting reinvested, which has always been getting reinvested in the Western world. In terms of social impact, it has led to improved lifestyle, urbanization, improved healthcare, and improved education. Society has basically come out of the post-subsistence stage to a more advanced stage, and the culture of these countries have changed due to the arrival of expats. In terms of political impacts, as we discussed, it has led to a lot of geopolitical conflicts, both internally as well as externally, primarily because of the oil. And one thing we have to notice is that politically stable countries have benefited more from the oil revenue than those which have unstable political system. In terms of climate impact, the oil-producing nations are taking active part in supporting the initiatives to reduce carbon footprint. They are signatories to the Paris Accord and actively pursuing projects like Smart City project like NEOM. So I'll conclude in like 2 minutes. Here are the final thoughts. Muslim community needs to have a good knowledge of the political and economic situation and the history behind what has brought us to the situation we are in. Many of the historical facts are facts that can be subsequently interpreted, but Muslim community needs to be aware of the facts before interpreting it appropriately. For example, when it comes to political and economic developments related to oil, we should have clear knowledge of what oil can bring and what it cannot bring. This is different from the typical statements that we hear. Oh, Allah has given us a lot of blessing through oil, but we are failing due to our bad deeds. There may be some truth to it, but it fails to acknowledge that just having resources is not enough. There are a lot of things that go with it, like how to manage the resource and how to avoid the resource curse that comes with it. These are real economic challenges that requires some finesse in thinking, which should at least be acknowledged to have a more productive dialogue. We also need to acknowledge that knowledge is power. Arab countries were just accepting 15 to 30% of profit before they sent their own students to study in US universities. These graduates from US universities came back and negotiated better deals and helped in breaking the oil monopoly of Western oil industries. So intellectual empowerment is very crucial in securing one's rights in the modern world. Just living aloof life and downplaying all the other non-religious knowledge will only make life more difficult for Muslims. And this is the primary objective of mine, which is to develop intellectual awareness at grassroots level, because better educated community will create better leaders who in turn will help the community in making the right decisions. With this, I will end the presentation. Thank you everyone for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.